My name is Avril Lavigne. I'm 61 years old, and for the most part, I've lived a quiet, honest life. After my divorce, I raised my son Ethan on my own, built a stable career as a dental hygienist, paid off my mortgage, and maintained my garden with a sense of pride no one could take away. I liked my solitude. I liked my routines. My little blue house with the white shutters and hydrangeas by the porch wasn't big or flashy, but it was mine. It was the one place in the world where I didn't have to answer to anyone. So when Ethan called one Sunday and said he was bringing someone home, I felt excited. It wasn't every day my son, now 29, asked to visit. He lived a few hours away, was climbing the corporate ladder in real estate, and I figured he was too busy building a life to visit his old mom. Still, every phone call ended with, "I miss you, Ma." This time, though, he had something else in his voice, nervous energy. And then came the words, "I want you to meet Amber." I blinked, holding the phone with both hands. Amber? My fiancée. That word echoed like a bell in my kitchen. You're getting married? I was going to tell you in person, but I couldn't wait. She's amazing, Ma. You'll love her. I tried to smile, even though my hands had gone cold. Of course I was happy for him, or at least I wanted to be. Amber was stunning in the way magazine covers are stunning. Long, wavy hair, bright blue eyes, a smile that felt practiced, like she'd spent years perfecting it. She wore a cream blouse tucked into slacks and heels that made a clicking sound on my hardwood floors as she walked through the house like she was inspecting it. "Oh, it's adorable," she said, running a finger along the windowsill. "It's got that quaint, lived-in charm." I forced a chuckle. "Well, it's been lived in." Ethan gave me a hug, that wide grin of his lighting up the room like it used to when he was little. I made lasagna. It was always his favorite. We sat at the kitchen table, and Amber asked all the right questions. How long had I lived here? How long had I worked in dentistry? Where did I see myself in 5 years? 5 years? It felt like a job interview, and I wasn't the one applying. After dinner, she excused herself to take a call. Ethan stayed behind, sipping wine. "So, what do you think?" I looked into my son's eyes and saw a version of him I hadn't met before. More polished, more confident, but maybe a little more fragile, too. "She's different," I said carefully. He smiled. "Yeah, she's got ambition. She seems very sure of herself." "She's had a tough life," he said quickly. "You'll see, once you get to know her." I nodded, even as something inside me stirred uncomfortably. They stayed the weekend. Amber brought an overnight bag the size of a suitcase and took over the guest bathroom with her skincare bottles and flat iron. By Saturday night, I noticed she'd rearranged the kitchen drawers. "I hope you don't mind," she said with a bright smile. "It just makes more sense to have the spatulas near the stove." I blinked. I suppose that's practical. On Sunday morning, she wore my bathrobe. "My towel was too small," she said, unbothered. "Hope that's okay." Ethan didn't say a word. Later that afternoon, the two of them sat me down in the living room. I thought maybe they were going to tell me about wedding plans or ask for advice on venues. Instead, Amber crossed her legs, leaned forward, and said, "We've been talking, and we'd love to move in here for a while." I blinked. "What?" "Just for a few months," Ethan added quickly, "until we can save a little more for the down payment." "We're so excited to live here," Amber said, grinning. "It's going to be so cozy." My mouth went dry. "But this is my home." "Exactly," Amber said, "and we'd never ask if it weren't important." "We just need some breathing room," Ethan added. "Rent in the city is crazy." They looked at me like this was already decided, like I just needed to nod along and be a good mom. I didn't say yes, but I didn't say no either. That was my mistake, because within a week, Ethan came by with boxes. Amber followed with shoe racks and throw pillows and a dog I didn't even know they owned. "His name's Bentley," she said. "Don't worry, he's hypoallergenic." I stared at the golden doodle chewing my mail basket and nodded slowly. By the end of that weekend, they were settled. Ethan set up a home office in the den. Amber began baking as if she were auditioning for a show. I'd come home from work to find flour on the counters, pies cooling on the windowsill, and Instagram captions in progress. "Look at this one," she'd say. #vintage vibes had baking at Mom's. I wasn't mom, I was moms, plural, social media friendly. My kitchen became a set. I tried to adjust. Told myself it was temporary. Told myself I was helping my son start his life. But as the weeks passed, my house felt less and less like mine. Amber began changing things, swapping out my curtains for brighter ones, storing my crock pot in the garage because it was too bulky, putting up wall art that said "Live, Laugh, Love" in big cursive letters. And then she started asking about my finances. "Do you have a retirement plan?" she asked one morning, sipping oat milk. "I've saved a little," I said cautiously. Smart, she replied. You've got great square footage here. This place would go for a lot if you ever wanted to sell. I'm not selling. Of course not, just thinking out loud. One night, I heard them arguing in the guest room. Ethan's voice was low, frustrated. Amber's was sharp, clipped. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but they were loud enough that it was impossible not to hear. She won't budge, Amber said. It's like she doesn't want to help us. She's trying, Ethan said. She just needs time. Well, time is money, and we're out of both. I crept back to my room, heart pounding. Things got worse when Amber suggested I take early retirement. You've worked your whole life, she said sweetly. Don't you want to relax? Garden more? Travel? I like my job, I replied. But don't you think it's time to pass the torch? She asked. I narrowed my eyes. To who? She smiled. To life. That's when I started to realize this wasn't temporary. This wasn't about saving for a down payment. This was about control. I spoke with Ethan alone one night. Son, this arrangement isn't working for me. He frowned. What do you mean? I feel like I'm being pushed out of my own home. He looked hurt. We're not trying to take over. Then stop acting like it. He ran a hand through his hair. You just don't understand, Amber. Maybe I don't, I said, but I know when I'm being squeezed. He didn't reply. He just left the room. The next morning, Amber was all smiles again. Fresh muffins, she chirped. Blueberry. I looked at the muffins, then at her, and I said nothing, because I had a feeling I'd be needing more than muffins to fix what was coming. By the end of their third week living with me, I couldn't walk into my own kitchen without asking if something had been moved for a reason. Amber had a habit of rearranging things, sugar bowl to the pantry, coffee mugs to a new rack she'd installed without asking, my grandmother's spice shelf replaced with something she called minimalist chic. I felt like a guest, or worse, a problem. The only time I truly had the house to myself was early in the morning. I'd get up around 6, feed the cat, sit on the porch with a mug of black coffee, and listen to the silence before Amber's voice returned to fill every corner. That silence became my sanctuary. But even that didn't last long. One Saturday, I was pruning roses in the garden when I heard Amber on the phone through the kitchen window. She wasn't whispering. She never did. No, she hasn't said yes to anything yet, she huffed. But I'm wearing her down. Trust me, she's not going to live alone forever. Old people hate conflict. My hands froze in the soil. Old people? Wear me down? I felt my cheeks burn. She laughed lightly, then added, and hey, if we get the deed in Ethan's name before she gets a lawyer, it's game over. My breath caught. What? That wasn't just casual overstep. That was a plan. That night, I made myself tea and went up to my room early. I locked the door. Not because I thought anything would happen, but because for the first time, I felt like I had to. I stared at the ceiling fan spinning above me and thought about all the little moments that had added up. Amber calling the guest room our room. Ethan setting up a printer in my craft space. The way they never asked anymore, just assumed. And now she was talking about deeds? The next day, I told Ethan we needed to talk. He followed me out to the garden, where the roses were blooming soft pink and quiet. I got straight to the point. Is Amber planning to take this house? His head jerked back. What? Is she talking about transferring the deed? Putting the house in your name? He looked down. She just brought it up once, but I told her it's yours. She thinks you'll convince me. I'm not trying to convince you of anything. Then why do I feel like I'm being squeezed out of my own home? He sighed. Look, it's just hard for her, okay? She didn't come from stability. She's scared. She wants something permanent. This is permanent for me. He looked at me then, like he was seeing me for the first time in weeks. And then came the line I'll never forget. She just wants to feel like she belongs somewhere. I stared at him. And what about me, Ethan? Don't I get to belong somewhere too? The conversation ended in silence. He walked away. And that night, Amber baked cookies, as if sugar could undo strategy. I called my friend Nora the next morning. Nora was a retired attorney who lived 2 blocks over and had known me since before Ethan was born. I need to protect myself, I told her. She didn't ask questions. She just came over with a file folder and a thermos of strong coffee. We sat in the sunroom, papers spread across the table. I want to update my will, set up a trust, and make sure no one can touch this house without my written permission. She nodded. We got to work. Days passed. Amber must have sensed something. She started being sweeter, invited me to lunch, asked about my childhood, made a photo album with Ethan to show our future kids where we came from. But the sweetness felt calculated, too perfect, and her eyes always watched for my reaction. I played along, because now I had a plan too. Then came the afternoon that pushed everything over the edge. I came home early from work, expecting the house to be quiet. Instead, I walked in on Amber giving a tour to 2 of her friends. "This'll be the baby's room," she said, gesturing toward my sewing room. I froze. "What did you just say?" She turned, startled. "Oh, Avril, I didn't hear you come in." "Baby's room?" She smiled. "We've been thinking ahead, just in case." "In case of what?" "In case we stay longer." Her tone was breezy, but I could feel the challenge under it. I looked at her friends, then at her, then at the room. My room. "No," I said quietly, "this ends now." She blinked. "What?" "You're not staying longer. In fact, you need to start looking for a new place. Today." When Ethan came home, all hell broke loose. "You're kicking us out?" "I'm reclaiming my house." "But we're your family." "Then you should have acted like it." Amber didn't speak, just stood there, jaw clenched. "You have 2 weeks," I said. "That's more than generous." Ethan tried to reason, but I was done reasoning. I was done being polite to people who thought they could wear me down. This wasn't about being old. It was about being awake. And I had never been more awake in my life. After I gave Ethan and Amber the deadline, the air inside the house changed. It wasn't just tension. It was electric. Amber went quiet, but cold. She no longer bothered with her cheerful voice or oversweet muffins. Instead, she gave me clipped nods in the hallway, slammed cabinets a little harder, and rolled her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking. Ethan became distant, not angry, just absent. He'd spend most of the day in the den-turned-office, emerging only to eat, barely making eye contact. The son I raised with warmth and effort had turned into a man who didn't seem to know how to stand up to the woman he was about to marry. They didn't argue with me about the move, not openly, but they didn't pack either, at least not right away. I kept my voice calm every time I reminded them of the date. 1 week left, I'd say, or 5 more days, just letting you know. I never yelled. I didn't cry. I kept watering my garden, going to work, and enjoying my early morning porch time. Because the truth is, I'd already started healing the moment I said no. 3 days before the deadline, Ethan knocked gently on my bedroom door. "Can we talk?" he asked. I nodded. We sat at the kitchen table, across from each other just like we used to when he was a boy and needed advice. Except now I was the one who had been hurt. "I know this isn't how you wanted things to go," he said. I waited. "And I'm sorry, I should have spoken up sooner." I nodded slowly. "Why didn't you?" He hesitated. "Because I didn't want to lose her." I sighed. "And you didn't think you might lose me in the process?" He closed his eyes. "I'm sorry, Mom, I mean it." I could tell he did, but the wound was still raw. "You didn't just bring home a fiancé," I said. "You brought someone into my space who thought she could rearrange my life." He nodded, eyes on the table. "And you let her." His shoulders sank. "She has a good side," he said quietly. "You saw a version of her that even I hadn't seen before." I leaned forward. "It's not my job to fix her, Ethan, or to save you from your decisions, but it is my job to protect what I built, and that includes myself." He looked up. "I get it now," he said. I believed him. But I also knew the damage was done. Amber didn't apologize. Not once. She packed her things with an icy efficiency, muttering under her breath and scoffing every time something didn't fit into her oversized luggage. She didn't say goodbye, didn't thank me for the roof over her head or the food she ate or the dozens of muffins she baked using my flour and sugar and butter. And honestly, I preferred it that way. I didn't want a fake apology. I wanted space. And finally, I had it. The first morning they were gone, I danced in the kitchen. I'm not exaggerating. I turned on the radio, poured myself a cup of strong coffee, and spun around in my slippers with a freedom I hadn't felt in months. The kitchen was mine again. The spatulas were back in their drawer. The Live, Laugh, Love sign had been tossed in a donation box, and peace, sweet, quiet peace, had returned. That afternoon, I walked into the guest room and saw it as it really was for the first time in weeks. The bedding was wrinkled. The shelves were cluttered with candle holders and forgotten magazines. The scent of Amber's lavender perfume still lingered faintly in the air. I opened the windows, let the wind carry it away. Then I stripped the bed, scrubbed the walls, and reclaimed the room, not just as a guest space, but as a reflection of me. Soft blue tones, a shelf of novels and a cozy chair. A place for people who respected the space they were welcomed into. I also made an appointment with Nora, my lawyer friend. "I want to take it one step further," I told her. "Let's make it crystal clear in writing. No one moves in again without my say-so." She smiled. "I thought you might." She helped me draft an updated version of my will. We created a simple trust for the house, ensuring that no future relationship, spouse, or misguided relative could ever challenge my control over it while I was alive. I walked out of her office lighter, not because I had more control, but because I had clarity. Life got quiet for a while after that. Ethan would text now and then, short messages. Thinking of you. Hope you're doing okay. Miss you, I replied politely. We weren't estranged, but we weren't back to where we were either. It would take time, maybe a lot of it, but I had enough self-respect now to let that time pass without trying to rush forgiveness. One day, a young woman came into the dental clinic where I worked. She was flustered, late, her shoes mismatched. I'm sorry, she said breathlessly. I've got a job interview after this and my sitter bailed. A toddler clung to her leg, teary-eyed and hungry. I gave her a kind smile. We'll get you taken care of. After her cleaning, I handed the little boy a sticker and a juice box from the break room. You've got this, I told her quietly as she stood to leave. She blinked, then smiled with tears in her eyes. You remind me of my mom, she whispered. The good parts. It took everything in me not to cry, because for the first time in months, I realized something. Even after everything, I still had kindness to give. Not because I owed it, but because it was mine to share when I chose to. Spring arrived softly, like an apology after a long season of noise. I started sleeping better, waking up without dread, no tension in my chest, no footsteps above my bedroom, just the hum of birds outside and the familiar creak of my floorboards. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was sacred. That first week in April, I planted new flowers along the edge of the walkway, hydrangeas, lavender, and my favorite, snapdragons. I hadn't had time to tend to them the last few months. Now it felt like a gift I could finally give myself. The garden looked more alive than it had in years. And so did I. One Saturday morning, I brewed a pot of tea and sat at the kitchen table with my journal. It had become a habit, 10 quiet minutes a day just to write down whatever was in my heart. Some days it was grocery lists. Other times it was memories of Ethan as a boy, chasing butterflies or building forts from pillows. But that morning, I wrote something I hadn't dared to before. I am proud of myself. It didn't seem like much, but those 5 words changed everything. I'd spent so much of my life making space for others, creating comfort for other people, adapting, smoothing over, saying yes when I wanted to say no, but not anymore. This was my house, my life, my rules. 3 weeks after Ethan and Amber left, I got a knock on the door. It was Ethan. He looked nervous, hands in his jacket pockets, hair a little messy like he'd been thinking too much and sleeping too little. Hi, Ma. Hi, Ethan. Can I come in? I nodded, led him to the porch instead of the kitchen. It felt safer that way. He sat across from me and let out a deep sigh. I wanted to say thank you, he said, for everything. I didn't speak, just listened. I've been thinking a lot, he continued, about the choices I made, about the way I let things happen without standing up for you or even for myself. You were caught between people, I said gently, but that doesn't excuse silence. He nodded, eyes lowered. I wanted things to be easy, he said. And Amber, she made promises. But when things got hard, she looked for someone to blame. I let that be you. I took a deep breath. Have you two talked since? He shook his head. We're on a break. Maybe permanent. I don't know. I let that sit. You're a grown man now, I said. You get to choose your life. Just make sure it's one you can live with when you're my age. He looked up, and I could see the boy I raised still hiding in there somewhere. I want to come back, he said. I raised an eyebrow. Not to live, he added quickly. To visit, to help, to be your son again, the way I used to be. That made my throat tighten. You don't have to earn your way back, I said softly, but it does take time. I'm willing to wait, he said. We sat in silence after that. Not uncomfortable silence, the kind that lets you breathe again. Over the next few weeks, Ethan did just that. He waited. He came by once a week, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with tools. We re-stained the back fence together one afternoon, barely talking, just letting the rhythm of the work speak for us. He didn't ask for a key, and that mattered more than he knew. I also started making new friends, joined a book club at the local library, started taking yoga on Thursdays. I wasn't trying to reinvent myself, just reconnect with parts of me I'd let go of. One day during a book club session, someone asked, "What's the biggest lesson you've learned in the past year?" The group went quiet. All eyes turned to me. I smiled. To never apologize for having boundaries, I said, especially in your own home. They nodded. Some even clapped, because it was a truth many of us had taken too long to learn. One warm evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I sat on the porch again, tea in hand, blanket on my lap. The house was glowing from the inside, lamplight warm and soft. Music played faintly from the radio. a gentle old tune I used to sing along with when Ethan was little. I looked out over the yard, the garden blooming, the gate freshly painted, the swing still swaying lightly in the breeze, and I whispered, "Thank you." To the house, to the silence, to the version of myself that finally spoke up. I didn't need a dramatic ending, or a big speech, or an apology wrapped in roses. All I needed was this: a door that only opened when I chose, a table where only respect was seated, and a life that belonged entirely to me. If I had to sum up everything this experience taught me, I'd say this: people will test your limits to see if you'll enforce them. And when you finally do, the ones worth keeping will respect them. The rest? They'll leave. Let them. Because what you lose in comfort, you gain in peace. And peace? That's the rarest kind of wealth.